The following is a conversation with Sean Kelly, the author of The Game, A Portrait of Scott Morrison. Scott Morrison is the recently defeated 30th Prime Minister of Australia. He was described in Sean's book as someone with a core ideology of deep confusion. All Australians listening to this will have their own idea about who Scott Morrison is, but for the rest who are not Australian, I will just say that Morrison was someone known as the Spin Doctor. He was the leader of the Liberal Party, which is the centre-right party in Australia, and his reputation was one largely of inauthenticity in desperation to be seen as just a normal, regular Australian. As I said, he was recently defeated. It was only a week or two ago that he was ousted from government and replaced by the centre-left party, the Labor Party, and its new leader, Anthony Albanese. Sean's book was really fascinating for more than just the portrait of Morrison that it paints, but also for the reflections on various modern parts of Australia's culture. It is really bloody interesting. Sean Kelly is an Australian journalist and a regular contributor to The Monthly. He was also a political advisor to Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. The podcast flows between us speaking directly about Morrison to us speaking more generally about the Australian culture. We do specifically mention, though, is Morrison a buffoonish Machiavelli? How politics is just performative rather than authentic? Morrison and religion? Australia as the lucky country? And then much more in that as well. So do stick around to the end to hear my afterthoughts and as well for me to explain what my ambition is for this podcast. And so here, with absolutely no further delay, adieu, here is Sean Kelly. If I had any promotional smarts, then we would have done this a few weeks ago. But just to catch up the audience, could you say who Scott Morrison is and what has happened in Australian politics in the last weeks? Just the high-level context to frame the chat.
Scott Morrison has been the Prime Minister of Australia since mid-late 2018. He won an election and then he recently fought another election. He won the last election in shock circumstances. Nobody expected him to win. So he was behind in the polls of this election. Everybody thought maybe he'll pull it off again, but he didn't. The country well and truly turned on him. He was desperately unpopular. He lost seats nobody expected him to lose, and he's no longer Prime Minister.
So even though he's no longer Prime Minister and his time might be done in the public eye, he's still an absolutely worthwhile character to think and talk about because he was the leader of our nation. So just to frame the question, I'm rather ignorant of Australian politics, having not lived in the country for 6-7 years now. And my image of Scott Morrison in the beginning of 2022 was that he was just this lucky oaf who stumbled into office. I watched Friendly Geordies, I heard what my mates said about him, and I found him to come across as just another politician who says things exclusively according to what the polls wanted to hear. I knew about his vacay during the bushfires, his uncomfortable coziness with Hillsong. I'm sure you get the picture. It's probably a broadly held opinion of Morrison, especially from my demographic. But then I listened to Turnbull's autobiography, and in there Morrison is credited as being quite a mover and a shaker, significantly more competent than that broadly held opinion might suggest. Now, in combination with your book, it now feels like Morrison is a bit more of a buffoonish Machiavellian, which is both a credit and a criticism. So does Bafoonish Machiavellian map onto your understanding of Morrison? And if so, could you just unpack that, please?
Bafoonish Machiavellian is a complex little combo moniker to unpack. Buffoonish in the sense that was the character he played, a little like Boris Johnson in the UK, I suppose you could say. But the Machiavellian streak, I think, is far more pronounced. In 2018, I was approached to write a profile of Scott Morrison. And I went about it the way you'd go about any profile. I looked at everything he'd said over a long period of time. I spoke to as many people as would speak to me. And when you're looking at a politician, there are really two aspects of them that you think will jump out. One is what they believe, and the second is what they've done. in public life, the causes they've fought for. And of course, those two things are united. If people believe in things strongly enough, hopefully they've fought for them at some point. And in Scott Morrison's life, in his political career, in his public career, which had stretched back decades, neither of these things were apparent, which makes it very difficult to write about a politician. And so I kind of stared at all of these facts. I stared at this problem for a very long time. And then I had one of those moments that you hope for as a writer. And in fact, if you do it for long enough, I think you have repeatedly as a writer, which is when you realize that what you think is the barrier to what you're trying to do is actually the door you need to push upon. And so I realized that the fact that Scott Morrison had managed not to define himself throughout his public life was in fact his defining feature. So you look at, there are many examples of this, but in terms of the Machiavellianism, he has three major moments when he comes to power. One, which is when he wins pre-selection for his local seat. He doesn't win pre-selection in the first instance. He loses the vote by 70 votes. I think he gets personally 8 votes in the first round of voting. Totally knocked out. The guy who he runs against ends up getting dragged down by a subterranean whispering campaign. There are allegations of racism in that campaign. That guy ends up exiting. Scott Morrison emerges, always says he had nothing to do with it. Then a while later, you have Scott Morrison becoming treasurer. To get there, the Prime Minister at the time is torn down. Again, Scott Morrison swears he has nothing to do with it, but other voices say different. And then it happens again. The exact same thing happens when he becomes Prime Minister. It seems to happen without Scott Morrison having anything to do with it. And yet, time and again, these subterranean battles end up with Scott Morrison on top. And that type of pattern is there throughout his career. There's some buffoonish Machiavellianism, but we can come back to the buffoonery if you like.
Yeah, well, maybe it'd be interesting to hammer down the Machiavellianism a little bit more. Turnbull, who was the Prime Minister before him, had this great quote, and I can't remember it now. You say it explicitly in the book as well, but how when you're speaking to Scott, you always feel like he's on your side. And then, as you just documented, on 3 occasions, you could definitely accuse Scott of being involved in, sort of maliciously dragging them down, through a whole bunch of, as you say, subterranean ways. That is in itself a crazy skill to have. Some of us have met people like that who can be unbelievably charismatic's the wrong word, but you feel like they get you, and they're on your side. And then they can go up to the next person, hold a separate set of beliefs, and have that person also think they're on their side. So Scott has this about him.
Well, I mean, certainly that is what some people around him say, and certainly the pattern is there to draw in his public life if you look for it. But of course, he denies it. So in the end, it depends on your individual judgment. But it's not just there in these in these particularly ambitious moments. There's a real pattern in Scott Morrison's life as well. It relates exactly to the exact things you're saying, Ryan, where he will say something in public, and then somebody will put it to him a day or two later, maybe a year or two later, and he'll say, "I never said that." And they'll come back at him and they'll say, "Well, I've got the record here," and he'll say, "No, I never said that." He'll be able to deny point blank things that are obviously true. He'll deny things that he's obviously done. He'll deny things that everybody knows he said. And the odd thing when he does that is he does seem to entirely believe it. The journalist Catherine Murphy has this great anecdote from a senator, Senator Nick Xenophon, and Morrison and Xenophon worked together on a number of things in the Senate before Morrison became Prime Minister. And at this point, Morrison's a minister. It's a few years later. They run into each other in the foyer of Parliament House, and Xenophon says to Morrison, "Scott, can we have coffee? Can we have a chat?" And Scott says, "Why?" And Xenophon says, "Well, I thought we worked well together. It'd be good to just talk about some policy." And Morrison says, "Oh, mate," and he laughs, "I'm purely transactional." And I mean, I think it's an incredible quote, but I
Mm.
also think it points to this idea that Morrison can move from one moment to the next without any sense of continuity. You know, most of us, if we're nice to somebody at one point, we feel the need to be nice to them again at the next point and nice at the point after that because we don't want to prove ourselves retrospectively insincere. You know, we have in our mind, I suppose, a story of our life. Whereas Morrison seems to just be able to shift from moment to moment and do whatever is needed in that moment. And he actually talks, I think, to Murphy about having a flow brain. And you know, not everybody will know what that is. It's a psychological term. It's migrated to business schools. It essentially means you're working and focused in the moment, and you lose all sense of time. And he says, I have a flow brain, and I have a terrible memory. I think those two things really fit this idea that Morrison can anchor himself to a moment and he can say whatever needs to be said in that moment. And in that moment, he truly believes what he's saying. And you can see that in his public performances. They're very
Mm.
convincing. Uh, I mean, he looks genuinely blindsided and dumbfounded when people put to him the contradictions. Uh, and that behaviour served him very well for a very long time. And eventually people began to see it. And at that point, his prime ministership began to crumble.
You could also read that as being, as well, a compliment to his Machiavellianism. He even found a psychological way to describe how he was, so people didn't think he was actually just a liar, which is the unfair way to describe that same phenomenon of him being able to go person to person in flow brain. You know, it does seem like a cheap way to get out of it.
Yeah, well, it's a spin term, isn't it? It's a corporate bureaucratic speak term, and Morrison, is full of that type of corporate bureaucratic speak.
This also just brings up something which isn't to do directly with Morrison, although he's certainly a part of it, but it's just broadly politics as I see it almost everywhere. Is that the antithesis to what you want in a leader? Um, you write that Morrison had the good sense never to make the mistake of attaching himself to clear beliefs. This is the opposite of what you want in someone who leads a country for a certain party. They must have certain beliefs that they're going to stand behind, rather than just be um, a paper bag in the wind according to the polls.
Well, look, I think in terms of traditional models of leadership, yes, and if you put it to the man or woman in the street, I think they would say exactly what you said, Ryan. But just because we think uh, we want a certain thing doesn't mean that's how we respond to it. And I think you only have to look at Morrison alongside his contemporaneous colleagues, Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, to say actually maybe there is something in the current zeitgeist, in the current political landscape, that actually makes people who have that ability extraordinarily successful. Because of course, each of them wasn't just prime minister. They or didn't become prime minister out of the blue. They had to get there. They had to fight their parties to get there. There was something in that skill set which served them very, very well in politics, and which won each of them at least one election. Uh, so I'm not. I guess I'm not convinced that people are as anti that as perhaps they should be.
Mm.
Um, and I think this points to why Morrison is interesting. He's interesting because of the similarities he has to those two men. Not that they're all exactly alike, they're not. There are very significant differences with them. But I think we have reached a place in our politics where there has become an opening for a certain, think I've heard this phrase, performance model. It's a model of politicians where performance is the main thing. And the thing about performance is that performance can shift from day to day. And, uh, in the book, I try to explain where I think that's come from. It's easy to pin it on social media, and I certainly think that's a feature, but I think it starts much earlier with television and images. And I think anyway, that's a very long answer, but my point is I wouldn't discount that model of leadership quite yet.
And it's also the sort of daily news cycle promotes that as well, right? Because and we saw this at the end of the last Australian political campaign. Scott Morrison tackled a kid, and that was the headlines everywhere for at least a day, potentially more than a day. And if you're just this performative element, I heard it explained recently, your campaign is just trying to win that day's headline, no matter how relevant it is to the overall policy or Australia that it might be. You just sort of maybe say something a little bit outrageous, but the Australian will really get behind, or you tackle a kid as like a fun buffoonish joke, like the rapidity of the news cycle.
Absolutely, and this goes back to Morrison's ability to shift from moment to moment in his own head. If all of us are doing that on some level, if all of us are in this, permanent present, and we are forgetting the day before, and we are evaluating people according to their most recent actions and their most recent speech, and we don't have a sense of narrative, historical continuity in our head, then that can be taken advantage of. And politicians who can recognise that and play to that can take advantage of that.
But since it's so like non-instinctual to map onto someone who's clearly inauthentic, who we know is just trying to get our attention by doing something shocking for that day, it could be sort of a display from the voter, the Australian public, that the Liberal Party did so badly in the previous election, maybe largely because they thought, hey, you're just treating. Do you think we're that stupid and we're just going to forget what happened a few days ago because you did something today? So maybe it could be not a reversal, but maybe a change in direction from that trend that you wrote about and just spoke about.
No, absolutely. Look, and this brings us back to the buffoonery bit of the Bafoonish Machiavellian. Scott Morrison, when he became Prime Minister, presented a very clear image to Australians. He decided that there were two aspects of him that he wanted everybody in Australia to know. One of them was that he cooked curries on a Saturday night, and the other was that he really loved the Cronulla Sharks, his local rugby league football team. And when I say he wanted people to know them, I don't mean he mentioned them, once or twice in passing. He gave his first TV interview to a rugby league star. He held a rugby league ball in one of his press conferences in his first week as Prime Minister. He ended one of the most serious radio interviews in the country, a radio interview that had talked about foreign affairs, had talked about bullying in politics, a range of other very serious subjects, with Go Sharks. And sure enough, almost every profile of Scott Morrison written after he became Prime Minister led with those two facts. They were taken to be not only things that could be mentioned in passing, but the most important facts about him. And they're tremendously illustrative. They suggest that he's suburban. He's a regular suburban bloke. They suggest that he's quite blokish. The cooking curries in particular suggests that he's tolerant. He's multicultural up to a point. He's modern. He cooks, but not too modern. He cooks once a week because he's still a bloke with an important job. And the
He's
point
not
I'm
that
making,
clean either.
right? And the point I make in the book is is that he would never use these terms, but he was presenting himself as a flat character. And what I mean by that is I draw on the novelist E.M. Forster famously had this theory of characters. You have flat characters and round characters in fiction. You have round characters who are complex, like somebody you know who might surprise you, and flat characters who are essentially caricatures. And the thing about Morrison is I think he did this very deliberately. Some people might present as flat characters because that is pretty natural. I think Scott Morrison went into that job knowing that he needed to get a sense of himself across to the Australian people very quickly, and that this was incredibly effective shorthand. So you had these two aspects absolutely beamed to the Australian people. And I think that got him through that short term. It got him through to the 2019 election. Uh, but what you're saying is exactly right. I think what we've had, in a sense, in real time, is this test of the performance model of politics. We've seen this a bit in the US, we've seen it a bit in the UK. In Australia, it meant that I think, Australians were able to look again at what had happened up to 2019 and then work out whether what they voted for then was in fact what they wanted to be able to keep voting for. Put it another way, they finally began to recognise that this guy was a performer first and foremost. That he was more interested in performing the role of Prime Minister than in actually acting or doing the role of Prime Minister. And at that point, I think they really turned on him.
Can you describe the significance of that curry that he made? Because maybe I read into it too much, but I almost got the sense that you were suggesting he didn't fully appreciate the gravity of the role he had when he went to Sri Lanka, or the hand he played in Sri Lanka, and then to just sort of say, oh yeah, this great tasty meal we're having in our safe home here, I picked it up while I was in Sri Lanka. Am I reading too much into that as like a nitpicky, or you're just, psychologizing from far away? Or
Look, that could absolutely be what was going on. I think it's hard to know sometimes with Scott Morrison exactly what was going on. It is definitely a strange behaviour. So he, this curry and football loving guy didn't emerge just when he became Prime Minister. It emerged for the first time in 2015. And that's not a coincidence. 2015 was the first year that people began to talk about Scott Morrison as a potential Prime Minister. It was when another Liberal Prime Minister got torn down, and it seemed for a little while as though Scott Morrison might be the one to replace him. So in a way, it was a dress rehearsal for what happened 3 years later. And in that year, Scott Morrison goes on this show called Kitchen Cabinet, which is where politicians cook a meal and they have a bit of an interview. And it was sometimes, it felt like a soft television program, but I think the interviews were sometimes quite revealing. And that's when, on this show is when Scott Morrison introduces this idea of himself as cooking curries. And he tells the origin story quite openly. He says he went away to Sri Lanka as shadow immigration minister and met with the Sri Lankan government and loved that trip and fell in love with curries while he was there, and so began cooking them. And the thing about his interaction as immigration minister, shadow immigration minister, and then immigration minister, his interactions with the Sri Lankan government is, the Australian government was collaborating with the Sri Lankan government to stop people fleeing Sri Lanka, and some of those people had very good reason to flee Sri Lanka. There was genuine political oppression. People were, by absolutely respectable accounts, taken away in white vans, tortured, and he comes back from Sri Lanka, where he's effectively striking agreements, or trying to strike agreements with the Sri Lankan government, and turns this into a kind of character gimmick. He decides that of all the foods he's going to cook on this cooking program, all of the foods he could choose in the world, Sri Lankan curries are going to become his shtick. And look, either that is just incredibly odd, and he is doing what I was talking about before, which is where he just kind of forgets the past and moves into the current moment, or it's a bit more cynical than that, and he's deliberately trying to kind of move on from this hardline immigration image that he'd kind of cultivated by doing the exact opposite, by kind of showing that he could actually reach out to Sri Lankan culture in some way. I suspect it's probably a bit of both. I suspect it's deeply cynical, and he wasn't quite aware of how horrific that was on some level. Anyway, I still think when you stop to think about it, it's extraordinary. But I think in a way, the more interesting thing is that most people don't stop and think about it. Not only does he get away with this gimmick, it becomes a central part of his public narrative, and I would argue a central part of what enabled him to win the 2019 election.
Yeah, I feel like though that no one really, and this I can only speak anecdotally, but no one really bought the notion that he was the super diehard Sharks fan, and even if he was, he kind of like ruined his authenticity as a Sharks fan by making such a big deal of it. Just because my own mates who live and breathe rugby league, they would be like, oh, Morrison doesn't know anything about him. Look, he's just getting a photo up, and it's kind of like if he had just not said anything about it, it would have come out organically somehow. People would have talked about how much of a long Sharks fan he was, and then the rugby league community would actually be like, oh, cool, our prime minister really loves the Sharks, kind of, and maybe that's just political campaigning and the super complex nuances of how you deliver a message. But for me, I maybe I'm just jaded by politicians, but I view all overt calls to you of communalism, something that you have in common with them, as staged and completely inauthentic.
Well, I guess I make two things of that. Firstly, I think it's important to remember always that most people are paying very little attention to politics. While there's broad cynicism about politicians, if the only two things repeated in a huge number of media reports are the fact that guy calls Curries and likes the Sharks, then I think enough people will take that at face value. And even if they don't believe it, if they stop and think about it, if they stop and converse about it, uh, it doesn't mean that they're not buying the overall sense of that person, which I think is more important than whether or not he actually loved the Sharks. And the overall sense is that he's this daggy dad from the suburbs. Like
Sure.
he's a bad
Yeah.
suburban guy.
Relatable. The everyman.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, because I think that he is. I think he is fictional on some level. You know, uh, there is a sense in which he was constantly creating himself um, for the cameras. And I think that's why that is a useful frame. It's a frame that has been used to discuss public figures and politicians. But I think what's interesting about Morrison is I think it really was very deliberate. Not that he had that
Mm.
wording or literary theory in his head, but I do think that effort was deliberate. Um, I mean that's one part of the answer to your question, but the other part is this cynicism we have towards politics, this cynicism we have towards politicians. Um, I don't think it necessarily means that we are um, good at seeing what's actually going on. In fact, I think it kind of lets us off the hook a bit. One of the, to get back to the TV thing that I briefly touched upon earlier, uh, there's this thing that happens in the 60s when TV first gets introduced. And Joe McGinnis writes this book, The Selling of the President in 1968, about Richard Nixon's campaign. And he talks about the advertising campaign that uh, that was run to help Nixon win. And that doesn't sound that interesting now because we've lived in this world for years and years and years. But at the time, this was a brand new world. This was the birth of a new world, and so you have these young guys, Roger Ailes, who goes on to head up Fox News before being accused by multiple women of sexual harassment. Um, Roger Ailes, a young guy at the time, says this is what politicians are going to be forever after. They're going to be performers. They're going to have to be performers. And the insiders, like the real insiders, are beginning to realize that it's all about performance now. And then you fast forward 20 years and you get to the point where journalists are beginning to reach this. And Joan Didion writes about Reagan. She writes these wonderful essays about Ronald Reagan and the Reagan-Dukakis campaign. And she talks about Dukakis throwing a baseball around on the tarmac. And she says these were deliberately staged moments. They were deliberately meaningless moments. And, and anybody who thought to draw attention to that would be naive and would be an outsider. But I think what's different about now, and you've drawn attention to this is that we all know it's staged now. We all know that we're watching a performance, but I don't think that's a great thing, because in a way, I think what's actually happened is the politicians realized they could perform. They got better and better and better at it. Journalists understood that, and I think over time have become more and more and more accepting of that. And that's part of why you see such meta-analysis all the time, what politicians are trying to do, rather than just what they've done. And then finally, I think you've seen the public catch up to the politicians and journalists and approach politics in exactly the same way, so that everybody now talks about politics in terms of images. We talk about politics not in terms of what the true meaning of what somebody has just done is, but what its political meaning is, what they're trying to convey to us. So that if somebody, let's say, locks up kids on an island, in an island hellhole, as part of their immigration policy, we no longer say they're acting cruelly, they're locking up children. People's first port of call, or the first port of call of a lot of the media, and I think of a lot of the public as well, is to say they're doing that to act tough. They're trying to send a message. They don't really want to lock up children, but they realise that's a political necessity. And once we jumped to that point of reading everything through political intention, of reading everything through performance, then politics almost ceased to have anything to do with reality. And that was a really damaging point. I think this is why Scott Morrison's interesting, because in a sense he was the peak of that. He's not unique. He's not the only politician, not in Australia, not around the world. But I think he was a kind of the kind of peak of that trend. But we hope so. It could still get worse.
It is also just like such a shame that it is so performative. Do you see any way out of it organically?
Well, look, I don't know. This election in Australia was interesting in that it's just been won by a guy called Anthony Albanese, and Albanese is less that than his predecessors. An old colleague of mine made this point, and I agree with him, that there has been this model of professionalised politicians, and you've seen it. You've seen it increase over decades. I think it's been really apparent in the last 10 or 15 years. Politicians who can answer questions in certain ways, who can dispute the premise of the question, who answer the question they wish they'd been asked rather than the question they'd actually been asked. All of those types of things that we're all familiar with now. And this bloke wasn't very good at that in this campaign. And in some ways, his campaign suffered because of that. He didn't do brilliantly. The Labor Party lost votes in the election, but he did enough to beat Scott Morrison and his Prime Minister. And, now he has the chance to test, I suppose, whether that model of somebody who's a bit less polished, who is trying a bit more to have a dialogue rather than bang you over the head with messages, can work. And a few people have made that point here. I think it's an important point. Maybe he does what a lot of politicians do, which is they realise that kind of soft, amiable, genuine approach doesn't work. They try it out for a while and then they give up on it, and they go back to very disciplined messaging and firing down the hold. Anyway, we'll see.
Peter Harcher, who is one of Australia's most well-known journalists, you quote him in the book that he said that Morrison is the biggest grub in federal parliament. Just to return to Morrison, the character specifically, Can you open up on that?
I mean, that came out of a really awful episode, which is Scott Morrison was in opposition. He was the shadow immigration minister, and there was this tragedy off the coast of Australia, off the coast of Christmas Island, I should say, which is part of Australia, but is a long way from Australia, from the Australian mainland. And a boat full of refugees crashed, and many people died. There were horrible images, and a few months later, funerals were held. And Scott Morrison came out and asked publicly whether taxpayers should really be paying to fly the family members of those who had died from Christmas Island, where they were being held in detention, to the Australian mainland, which is where the funerals were being held and where the burials were going to be. And it's it's awful,
Mm.
genuinely awful. These people,
Impossibly out of touch thing to say publicly, even sort of
well,
think privately.
well, the terrible thing, Ryan, is I'm not sure that it was out of touch, and certainly Scott Morrison didn't think it was out of touch, and he got a lot of support. There were a lot of angry talkback callers that day and the next day agreeing with Scott Morrison, and he would say later that he was expressing what had been put to him by ordinary voters. He felt that people were really angry about the idea that taxpayer money was being spent to fly refugees to these funerals. And, he was probably right. But it was that doesn't mean it was the right thing to say. A lot of
Mm.
people can believe something, and our politicians should try to rise above that and try to maintain some civility, maintain some humanity. Uh, awful moment. And then, of course, he goes on radio and he kind of backtracks. Uh, and apologizes and is widely reported as having apologized, but actually all he does is apologize for the timing. He doesn't ever say the
Yeah,
comments were made.
exactly.
He says that the timing of the comments, the fact that he made these comments, and I don't think I even mentioned this, he made them, on the day of the funeral and the day
Mm.
before the funeral. Uh, just says the timing of the comments was insensitive. So it's this incredibly narrow apology. And I know we are used to politicians making narrow apologies, so fine. But the point I think is, I'm not sure he really thought they were the wrong thing to say at any point. And that seems awful. So
Mm.
that's why Peter Harcher wrote that column. And,
Mhm.
Peter Harcher was right to write that column.
That whole passage, it was several pages on Scott Morrison as a shadow immigration minister and talking about Christmas Island and Nauru and all of that. I really learnt a lot about Australia's politics there as well, which is a compliment to the book. You sort of, obviously you talk about Morrison, but then there's like these short essays on big Australian topics. I don't know, is that a bad way to say it?
Okay.
On, big Australian issues. And I really did enjoy the one on migration. I don't think we have time to touch on it though, so that can be something for people to read. Because we have to touch on one of the biggest parts of Scott Morrison's personality, which is his religion. And in Australia, we definitely have a strong religious belt. Half of my family don't believe in, the world started with the Garden of Eden, right? So it's surprising for others maybe to know that there is lots of very devout people in Australia. Particularly for Europeans, it might be surprising. Americans less so. But anyway, our last leader, Scott Morrison, was deeply religious, very closely tied with the Hillsong Church, which I'm sure many people have heard of as well. Curiously enough, it's from Sydney. But could you talk about Morrison's religious beliefs? Because you also wrote another very interesting short essay on, how it had to do with the work of the anthropologist Lerman. But I just want to let you speak about Morrison and religion for a while, please.
Look, I guess the most important thing is that Scott Morrison is a deeply religious person. I think it's a very sincere part of who he is. Some people have been quite cynical about it and argued that it's a bit of a performance as well. I don't think that's true. Um, but I do think this is true of any politician. Everything in their life becomes political in the end. And they all find a way to use everything politically. And that was definitely true. That is definitely true for Scott Morrison uh, and religion, because um, as you said before, there was this real sense that Scott Morrison doesn't really believe in anything very clear, and his political career is free of, you know, expressions of conviction in anything. But he's always been very clear that he's a religious believer, And he speaks about it very openly and very directly in his first speech to Parliament, hugely symbolic speech to Parliament. And he talks about being guided by these principles and about the part that they should play as he acts in public life. And then, pretty much from that moment on, he refuses to be held to anything. Whenever people ask him about religion, he won't talk about it. He won't talk about his beliefs. But he's quite public about the fact that he's a believer, to the extent that the cameras were allowed into church during the 2019 campaign. And I think that helped him politically, and that I think it probably brought a lot of religious communities in Australia along with him in the 2019 campaign. But I think it played this other role, which was to substitute for that lack of belief. It made clear that actually he did believe in something. So there was this anchor, but because it was religion, and because religion is so sensitive, it enabled him a way to never actually talk about what those beliefs were. So it was this way of telegraphing that he did have convictions without ever actually having to talk about convictions in any specific way, which is utterly in keeping with Scott Morrison's entire approach to public life. It's all about signalling and symbolism without ever actually getting into specifics, anything that he might be able to be held to later. And so that's the first thing I think to note. And then the second thing is...
Sorry to interrupt you, Sean, but I just want to wrap on to the end of that first statement, which is in accordance with the opening sort of Machiavellianism. You don't want to fully attribute it to him, but super calculated in almost everything that happens and touches the public world. Nothing's natural.
Yeah. Absolutely. And one of the points I make in the book is that one of the strange things about Scott Morrison is the fact that he seems almost never to commit gaffes. Gaffes in the Kinsley sense that they express something true about yourself. There is never really a sense with Scott Morrison that the mask slips, and that comes back to the flat character thing. With most of us, with round characters, with real people, the mask slips. Something comes out that surprises people. Something comes out that speaks of some other truth. With Scott Morrison, you never really get that. There is a sense that the mask is up all the time. And yes, another way to put that is that everything is being calculated.
You were rounding off a second point there that I interrupted you.
I was just going to say, a lot of people have tried to burrow into what might be Scott Morrison's religious beliefs, to try to kind of reverse engineer what his political beliefs might be. I think that's a mistake. I think it's a mistake because what Scott Morrison has said and done in public life, and this is true of every political actor, I think, is the best guide to what you need to know about Scott Morrison. Like at this point, if there is some secret agenda and secret belief system, then either it is present in his public comments and public actions, or it's not important enough to have affected those public comments and public actions, in which case we don't really need to spend time looking for it. And I think this is a mistake people often make with politics and politicians. We go looking for some secret self. We go looking for some key to them, when actually it's all there on the surface. If somebody's been in public life long enough, the things that will tell you most about them as a public figure are there. They are readily available. Which is why this book is in a way like it's a textual analysis. It's an analysis of the way that Scott Morrison has presented himself in public life. It's not an attempt to, talk to 1,000 people to discover if there's some other Morrison hiding out of sight. I think the most important Morrison is the one that's actually there on the surface.
Mm. And there's so much more about as well his work before he was the Prime Minister or even the Shadow Minister of anything. He's working the New Zealand Tourism Board. He was behind the Where the Bloody Hell Are You ads. There's a lot of more interesting detail that really does round out this full profile of Morrison. But I don't think, but just for the dual sake of time, but also so people have something to go and follow up with if they really want to learn more about this guy. It's nothing beats the original text. But I've made reference a few times to sort of mini essays in the book. One of the most interesting was your take on the lucky country and how that sort of ties into national pride and identity. So if you could give the full quotation and describe what the second half of the quotation really means, and then explain all that, please.
Well, I don't have it in front of me, but you know, Australia has Australia has this uh, moniker, the lucky country, and it comes from a book by Donald Horne, who is a public intellectual and a journalist, and he described Australia as the lucky country, and it's kind of been unironically adopted, but it was meant kind of ironically. The point that Horne was making is that Australia was a lucky country run by, this is something approximating the actual quote, second-rate people with second-rate ideas. His point was that the elites who run Australia were really not that imaginative or skilled themselves and often stole ideas from overseas, and that Australia's success was due to luck to an enormous degree. But Australians kind of wear it as a badge of pride that we're the lucky country. Um, I think that the interest, well, there are two interesting things about Horne's book, at least two interesting things. The first is that it remains incredibly relevant. That you read this book, which is written, what, 50 odd years ago, um, a bit longer, I think, and it is as good a description of Australia as you could hope to find, in terms of the mentality, in terms of the way sport sits at the centre of the Australian character, the complacency that drives Australia, because that was Horne's point ultimately, that Australia was a deeply complacent place, and that the elites in particular were complacent. But the second thing I think is that, retrospectively, my belief is that Horne let Australians off the hook a little bit. He decided to ping the elites. He decided to say, well, the elites are the problem, not the ordinary people. And it probably, I think he believed that entirely. I think it was a sincere belief. I think it probably also helped the book. Certainly, it's a harder sell job to if you're caning a whole country. But I don't think that was the reason he did it. Uh, but I do think Australia has this habit of letting ourselves off the hook, of believing that the problem is always somewhere else. The problem is always someone else's problem. And the thing about Australia is that, um, most Australians, certainly many Australians, can afford to be complacent. It is a rich country. These days, it is a ridiculously rich country. It is a beautiful country, with a, until recently, a pretty good climate in most places. Uh, it has a universal healthcare system, an incredible healthcare system. So I think for a lot of Australians, it is actually an easy place to live. They don't want very much to change. But of course, that's not true for all Australians. And I think the difficulty for the broader population is that I'm not sure it's true of any Australians in the medium to long term. Some very big challenges are coming at Australia very fast, which I think we're just now beginning to wake up to. Geopolitical terrain, the rise of China, in our region, the climate, obviously a massive issue everywhere and a massive issue in Australia now, with floods and bushfires having dominated politics recently. I think all of these things are beginning to wake Australians up a little, but I think our default position for many decades has been head in the sand. Things will be all right. We are lucky. We will remain lucky.
Yeah, that was the takeaway that I got from that as well. Like the default position was just, we'll be right. We're the lucky country. Things are going to sort of remain on the same path that they have for the last, 50, 60 years. Where does national pride and identity and perhaps even tall poppy syndrome come into that as well? Do they interlink?
Uh, Yeah, I think the thing about tall poppy syndrome, which is this tendency in Australia to try to cut down, um, people who succeed. Uh, I think there are a couple of things going on there. One is that it is a way of kind of pushing the problems elsewhere, of saying that it's actually, those who succeed who are to blame for the problems and not other people. And it's also a way of, uh, you know, it's a way of insisting on our own ordinariness, I suppose. Um, a way of insisting that we're all just, you know, ordinary people uh, doing our best, which, and so if somebody succeeds, you kind of try to cut them down and pull them back. Uh, and I think that is another way, again, of saying, well, things don't involve us. We're just focused on everyday life.
It's a hard thing to articulate, isn't it? But I mean, why are those two necessarily interlinked? Being the lucky country and cutting people down. And forgive me if
Um,
you don't have a tight answer on it. Like I've said, it's being edited, but
hmm.
just in case
No, look,
you have thoughts.
it's a really good question. It's not a question I've directed myself to before. Um, I guess my answer would be this. I think that we are deeply complacent as a country. I think that stretches back from those years and years and years of luck, and the lovely belief that that luck will continue indefinitely. Uh, and I think but I think in some part of ourselves we're scared. We're scared that's not necessarily true, and that brings with it a defensiveness. And that defensiveness makes us want to cut down anyone who, might depart from the overwhelming, uh, might depart from the weight, the weight of public opinion. Who might try to shift away from where most Australians see themselves. Who might try to suggest things could be different, or to suggest things are different from the way that most Australians see them. The arts and artists have never been really been held in great esteem in Australia, and have always struggled in certain ways. I think that's part of the reason that Australians don't like to be told in any way that there might be a problem here. Because if we have to acknowledge that there's some problem, if we have to acknowledge perhaps we're not seeing the world in the correct way, or if there are problems heading our way, um, then perhaps we're not behaving in the correct way. Perhaps we're actually living life wrongly, and we wouldn't be so defensive about that if there wasn't some small part of us that was worried that was the case. And I think you see this kind of overreaction to repression. It's the repressive instinct. It's a human thing in lots of aspects of the way Australia talks about itself and its past. There's this constant culture wars debate about Australia's history, and Australia was very, very, very bad at talking about its history and acknowledging its history and acknowledging the invasion and the massacres of Indigenous people that lie at the foundation of the modern Australian state. Uh, and we don't just kind of refuse to talk about them. We kind of overbalance. So we people, leading politicians insist on like really hammering pride and being proud, and you see it in the kind of the high contrast language that they employ. It's never enough to just greys are never enough. Complexity is not to be tolerated. You have to kind of overbalance to pretend something doesn't exist completely, to go in the exact opposite direction. And I think that is repression uh, all up.
Has Morrison read your book to your knowledge?
Look, I doubt it. I doubt it. Certainly not to my knowledge.
Okay, and what about feedback from his, I don't know, his political party or his side of the aisle? Um,
Look, um, I have heard that some people on his side of the aisle, have appreciated some of the insights. um, but I've not had any aggressive phone calls or anything. I definitely think that there was some awareness of some of the observations that I made. I don't know whether they were first hand or second hand, but I certainly began to see some defences against some of the things that I had written in some of Scott Morrison's language. So it made me wonder if somebody there had at some point gotten around to reading it. But
Mhm.
you never really know how these things come
Sure.
together.
um, and also, this is, a bit of a cheap question, but nonetheless, I think a fun one. Where does he rank for you on the list of Australia's prime ministers?
Well, look, I am not a historian and a historian of Australian prime ministers, so I don't have a good answer to that. I'll give you a slightly oblique answer, which is more a question that I've been thinking about recently. Um, when you talk to people on the left, um, they're often much angrier at Scott Morrison than they are at Tony Abbott, another recent Australian prime minister.
And
And
Abbott
Tony
was
Abbott,
much worse, right?
well, I mean, some more learned people than me, like Judith Brett, say so. Um, he was certainly more ideological. He was certainly more right wing, uh, and has remained more right wing. You know, he's flirted with the replacement theory, which is pretty awful. Um, uh, but people seem to detest Scott Morrison more, and that's really interesting to me because it's almost as though they find somebody's lack of belief harder to stomach than somebody who believes things that are utterly offensive to them. And I'm not sure that's the correct judgment, but it's interesting to me.
It could also just be that it's been 10 years ish since Abbott, and the amount of more young, active people in
Mm.
politics and how much more further to the left through social media a lot of young people will necessarily be on could just be it could just be statistics is lying to us, and in fact it might seem like they hate Morrison more, but
You're
in
right.
fact if you could put Abbott next to him right now, um, yeah, I think
Yeah, it's a good point.
I agree with your sentiment. I mean, Abbott was just so much further to the right,
Mm.
and kind of like a malicious character, if you believe what Turnbull writes about him, at least. But Turnbull has every incentive to talk shit about Abbott. So,
True.
um, anyway, I've got two more for you that I like to ask every guest if possible. But
Okay.
before I do, I just want to say that there's also a lot of interesting stuff I'd like to speak with you about at some stage. Rudd's war against Rupert Murdoch. Some further sort of parts about the Australian culture and the Australian political landscape. I think it'd be interesting to hear your take on them, because I think I didn't say this on air, but the book is very easy to read because it is so well written, and it's not just this profile of a prime minister. It's also a very interesting reflection on some of the parts of Australian culture. So again, I just want to say, really liked it. I like the way you think. I think it's really cool. So finally, two questions I like to ask everyone. What country are you most bullish on?
Most bullish on?
Yes.
uh, my new favorite country in the world is Finland.
Okay. Why is that?
Uh, just it's just really cool.
They're
Also
legends.
turns out I love sauna.
Nice. Okay, yeah. Well, there's no better place in the world for you than bloody Finland. They are sick. Have you read Jared Diamond's book Upheaval?
No, haven't.
It's about nations in crisis. It's fascinating. It's like 7 chapters. Australia is one of them. Indonesia, Chile, Finland, and he talks about the role of identity, the political institution, and the crisis that faced them. And after
Okay.
World War II, Finland, for the umpteenth time, had to stave off the Russians and the Soviet Union. And
Mm.
it's remarkable that Finland was never absorbed into the Soviet Union, because they're a tiny population of 5 million people. But they're really a warrior society. They're amazing. I absolutely love Finnish people and Finland. So great answer. And I also think the first time Finland's been mentioned, so that's cool too. Finally, a conversation between any two people, no language barrier, dead or alive, a podcast.
Ooh. Oh, okay. Um, Look, I wish I had longer to think about this because I'm not sure this is where I'd get to in the end. But my first thought is Janet Malcolm interviewing Sigmund Freud uh, would be interesting.
Who's Janet Malcolm?
She wrote. She, she writes a number of books that kind of look very closely at what people say and then texts that people have written. But she started out writing um, about psychoanalysis and Freudian psychoanalysis, of course, and and that Freudian approach is there in a lot of her later works, and it would be very interesting to watch her go to the source.
So psychology's on your mind, eh?
I guess it must be.
Yeah. Hey, Sean, thank you very much, mate.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks so much for having me on today.
So cheers, Sean. Thank you so much again for giving me your time, mate. Like I sort of said to him off air, and I think I opened up the first question with, I don't have the promotional smarts to do this podcasting thing the right way. Sean and I have been in correspondence for several months now, but somehow I managed to organize to do the podcast after the election and after all of the hype around Morrison and Australian politics has sort of reached its peak. But so be it. But nonetheless, it was still fascinating to read Sean's book and to learn about the leader of the Australian populace of the country of Australia, and then all the implications that come in that as well. You know, what does it mean about Australia that this is the person that we elected? What are the issues that really matter? I learned shit tons about Australia, especially modern day Australia, from reading this book, and ultimately that's the thing that fascinates me most. I'm so jaded and kind of cynical when it comes to the politics of the left or the right or different parties that I kind of tune out and don't really care at all. But it's an inevitable thing that sort of one has to pay attention to if they're gonna maybe understand a country a little bit more nuanced beyond just generally, oh, is it left, is it right? It's sort of there are different paradigms to look at it, I suppose, these days, but maybe it always has been that case. But Scott is no longer the leader. He's been replaced by another fella, and as Sean said in there, it kind of might be a positive reflection of how sort of jaded the Australian populace became with the performative nature and inauthenticity of Morrison's presentation and politics. And if that is the case, then I would say that is a good thing for Australia and hopefully could be a representative wider phenomenon as well. But anyway, I'm sort of just rambling on now. Cheers again, Sean, for doing it. I really, really do appreciate you offering your time. This morning, I'm actually recording and releasing on the same day. So, what is my ambition for this podcast? If this is the first time you've listened to this show, then welcome. Thank you for listening. My ambition for this podcast is to corner the podcast market for eclectic curiosities in whatever country it is you're listening in from. So I know that might sound like a bit of a mouthful, and what even is an eclectic curiosities market to fill. But basically, as you'll see, this podcast ranges a lot of different interests. Last week was geothermal, today Scott Morrison, next week will probably be Christopher Hitchens. It is just a reflection of my own eclectic curiosities, and hopefully there are a few episodes in there that are also mapped on to your own curiosity. So that is the ambition for the podcast, to corner the market in all of your countries for eclectic curiosities, whatever that means. Now, it's quite a lofty, ambitious goal, but nonetheless, making it actually isn't even that important, isn't it? It's just having the goal of doing it. So in order to achieve this goal, I would ask that you leave nice, healthy, juicy reviews of the podcast on the various podcast distribution algorithms. If you're on Spotify, a simple 5 will do. If you're on Apple, a simple 5 plus a nice comment will do. Encourage people you meet on the streets and your family and everyone you know to also leave nice, healthy, positive, juicy reviews. that is the absolute best thing that you could do for this show to help me realize the ambition of cornering the podcast market for eclectic curiosities. So please, thank you. Welcome. Ciao.